think we should probably get the ball rolling.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for attending today's webinar on the use of carbon credits to enhance corporate climate action. My name is Ashni, and I'm Head of Accounts and Communications at Trove Research, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. The panelists for today's webinar include Guy Turner, our CEO, Lucian Georgeson, our lead policy analyst, and we also have two wonderful guest panelists joining us today, Hannah Hislop, Global Sustainability Senior Manager at Unilever, and also Chris Leeds, who is the Head of Carbon Markets at Standard Chartered Bank. On today's webinar, we will cover the current use of carbon credits today, the current guidance to the use of carbon credits, the VCMI proposed claims guidance, and defining high quality carbon credits, as well as the importance of good disclosure. We will then move on to our open panel with our guest speakers before finishing in Q&A. A couple of housekeeping things before we start the webinar. So the first half of the webinar will be a presentation from the Trove team, followed by a panel discussion and then open Q&A. All attendees are automatically muted, so please only raise questions by clicking on the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will then facilitate Q&A at the end of the webinar. The slides alongside the recording of this webinar will be uploaded to the Trove Research website tomorrow, so feel free to share that alongside along with your colleagues and organisations. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Guy, who will give you a brief introduction of Trove.
Thank you, Ashni, and welcome everyone. This is the second webinar that we've done on recently. The first one was a review of the market in Q1. The subject of this one really is to look at the demand side of the voluntary carbon market and look at some of the latest guidance and around how companies can or should use carbon credits to enhance their climate action. Just a quick overview of Trove for those who don't know us. We are a data and information company that supports corporate climate action, and in particular through their use of carbon credits. We have a very comprehensive set of information that can assist in that process. We monitor all of the policy initiatives around the world. We look at all the carbon projects. We monitor all corporate climate commitments and their progress against their targets and their use of carbon credits, as well as the price of carbon credits that are being seen in the market today. So if you have any questions on that, please let us know. We're upgrading and enhancing the platform continually. We have added a consultation tracker in the policy landscape. We're adding country profiles to understand what's going on the ground in a lot of the developing countries. We're adding new registry and project data. We've got enhanced performance metrics, mapping tools. We're developing and will release very shortly carbon price forecasts and scenarios, a price predictor tool, and a whole bunch of extra data on corporate climate action and carbon credit demand. So it's pretty busy on this side of things. So please do get in touch if any of those are of interest. So as Ashni said, we're going to run through some quick analysis that we've been doing on the use of carbon credits and the guidance that exists today. First off, on the corporate climate commitments, as anyone in this industry knows, there is a whole smorgasbord of terms that are used. One of the challenges is trying to make sense of those. They tend to fall into two main categories: carbon neutral, or sort of synonyms to that, which relate to the immediate claim around the use of carbon credits to claim some kind of neutrality or offsetting for a product or service or company. And then net zero, or future targets that sort of set a longer term trajectory on both mitigation and the potential future use of carbon credits. And companies hitherto have been quite flexible in their use of that terminology. I think a lot of people in the industry have a sense of what these terms mean, but what would be really helpful is if we can coalesce around a smaller number of terms going forwards. We track a lot of these, if not all of the company claims and their emissions footprints and their future targets. And one of the interesting things is that the SBTI, Science Based Targets Initiative, has done a fantastic job in setting up a very simple set of objectives and criteria that companies can ascribe to in setting long-term net zero goals. Interestingly, we've also identified a number of over 400 other companies that also have net zero objectives or commitments, but are not aligned with or not subscribed to SBTI criteria. So 461 of them in total. Some of those are oil and gas companies with very large carbon footprints, others in a number of other sectors. We also track the kind of claims that companies are making today. And currently, we have 182 firms who we've tracked who are making carbon neutral claims and are directly using carbon credits. That's not all the market. We're adding to that all the time, and it's a work in progress. But it's a very useful starting point to understand where the immediate demand is appearing today. In total, we have over 6,000 companies that we're tracking and analyzing. So where are carbon credits being used today? Well, this most latest data on this chart goes back to 2020. So this is the voluntary carbon credits retired at individual company level, but aggregated up to sectors going back between 2017 and 2020. A large part of this data comes from the CDP, and if analysed in the right way, can be quite interesting. And I think one of the interesting, this covers about 2/3 of the market. Of total retirements, and in 2020, actually, the largest sector retiring credits was that was part of the CDP reporting process was actually transportation and storage, and a lot of those were airlines, so 38%. Manufacturing was the second largest sector at 24%, and mining and including oil and gas was only 14%. Now, if we looked at 2021, I think we'd see a different split with oil and gas starting to show up more prominently. But interestingly, a lot of the talk in the sector is around financial firms, maybe professional services, the tech companies in America, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, etc. They make a lot of news headlines. But actually, in terms of total volume of carbon credits used, it's actually the more energy-intensive sectors that are actually buying the vast volume of credits. So transport, airlines, probably medium energy intensity, manufacturing, and mining and oil and gas. So that's actually quite an interesting trend, and one that one can extrapolate forwards and potentially think, well, how much more carbon credits do these companies need? Well, actually, the answer is a lot if they continue to acquire carbon credits in the same way. So that's some interesting patterns that we're seeing today. This chart shows the use of carbon credits up to the end of May, month by month, according to the type of project and this is Trove Research Analysis. And a couple of observations from this. One, we saw a peak in December last year in terms of retirements, and it's fallen off since then. We also saw a peak, the previous peak was in October, around just prior to COP last year, COP26 in Glasgow. December, perhaps a year-end rush, and we've reached more of a steady state since then at a considerably lower level. The other observation is that we see over the last 12 months on the right, a significant proportion of credits being nature-based, red, so reduced emissions from deforestation, nature restoration, much lower. But surprisingly, in spite of all the attention that and good attention that nature-based projects get, the majority or the largest type of projects that most frequently used projects are renewable energy projects. 42% of all retirements in the last 12 months have been renewable energy. And one of the reasons for that is they have traded at a significant discount to the nature-based projects. So why has this fallen off when we had a very sort of significant increase in demand over the last 12 months, or certainly in 2021? This is an overlay of the oil price, the world oil price, or US West Texas Intermediate crude, and is now at $110, $115 a barrel. Now, there was an increase in price during 2021, but a very significant change has occurred in 2022, driven partly by the problems in the war in Ukraine, compression of supply, and it's feeding through into a whole host of commodity price increases, which is feeding through into inflation, which can then kick into changes in demand. So I think there is a material impact in the market that we've seen in the last quarter, and that's, I think, a sort of fairly sort of obvious constraint that corporates have on budgets. This is, one hopes, a short-lived crisis, and one of the other trends we've seen is, in spite of the changes in purchasing patterns, no reduction in the number of companies signing up to longer-term targets, net zero targets under SBTi, which to us suggests that the corporate sector is still very active and has long-term ambitions to set targets and follow through on them in the longer term. It's something that we monitor on a weekly basis through our weekly, if you're not signed up to it, please, it's free. It's our weekly digest of corporate climate action and the target setting that they publicly disclose. So from that point of view, we're sanguine in the medium to longer term, in spite of the troubles that we're seeing across the economy. Actually, it's not just in corporate climate action, as a resulting of the commodity cycle crisis that we're in at the moment. Part of the reflection, a lot of these dynamics are reflected in price, and this is our weekly, a summary of our weekly pricing report going back to the start of the year, and a couple of trends that we see here. Nature-based projects trading nearly double the price on average to the basket of reduction type projects, so fuel switch, renewable energy, non-CO2 gases. These are the weighted average prices. There's a lot of variation and range between these on a project by project basis, but those, the exception of last week, those types of projects trading in a corridor of $5 to $8 a ton over the last 6 months, and somewhat converging as well, sort of becoming a commodity in their own right. Whereas red, so still a reduction type project, is still much more attractive for the ecosystem and biodiversity advantages that they have, and also nature restoration as well. So growing new vegetation, storing carbon, sequestering carbon through that, trading in the $12 to $14 range. So a lot of action. That's how carbon credits are currently being used across the world. I will hand over to my colleague Lucian, who will talk you through the current state of guidance on what companies should and shouldn't be doing.
Thanks, Guy, and more importantly, thank you to everyone for joining us here today. It's really great to see so many of you on the webinar today. And yes, as Guy said up at the top, when we look at the guidance landscape, there are two main drivers of claims for companies, which is carbon neutral and net zero. And fundamentally, we see two main differences between them, which is the time and the role of credits in meeting those claims. So we see net zero as a future status that companies commit to achieve, and removal credits only are used to neutralize unavoidable emissions at that net zero target year and thereafter in the future. Net zero must be reached by 2050 at the latest, but there are some organizations like the Climate Pledge that are encouraging countries to set earlier targets for net zero, like 2040 or earlier. And then, oh, sorry, can you just go back? And then carbon neutral is a present day claim to compensate for the current carbon footprint, principally through the use of reduction, but also sometimes removal credits. But the principal carbon neutral standards, like the two that we were showing here, still do require a commitment to reduce emissions over time, but that level is not specified. And at this point, we wanted to just dive in and highlight a little some of the differences between the SBTi's science-based targets and the SBTi's corporate net zero standard, especially as the previous version of the science-based targets criteria for target setting will not be valid after the 15th of July. So the short-term requirements of the net zero standard are more stringent than the current science-based targets requirements, but with the new V5, which is currently can be used by companies, but will be the only version of the science-based targets that can be used after mid-July. These are being brought in line with the requirements of the net zero standard. So here we see that going forward, SBTi will only validate 1.5 degree aligned targets across all scopes, but allowing scope 3 emissions to be covered by a well below 2 degrees target, but only in the short term. And the net zero target sets the boundaries for the scope 3 coverage in the long term at 90%. And while this covers the overall picture, the SBTi are also building out more sector-specific guidance and reduction pathways. Here again, the timing is important. There are different reduction pathways for industries that face higher barriers to initial barriers to decarbonisation, like cement and steel, but much steeper reduction pathways for sectors that the rest of the economy will rely on in order to decarbonise and reach net zero, particularly the power sector, but also service buildings here, for example. And this is why we can see very, very steep reduction pathway here for the power sector of getting down to 70% reductions from baseline by 2030, and which is the only way that a number of other sectors are going to be able to hit these very ambitious reduction pathways. One other sector to note, that important to note on the SBTi guidance, that as it's a little bit different, is the long-term target for forestry, land use and agriculture, which is 80% reductions by net zero target year, which compares to over 90% reductions for the rest of the economy. And this is relevant not just for companies that see themselves as being within the forestry, land use and agriculture sector, but also companies that have significant share of their footprints in that sector, because they too will have to cover their forestry, land use and agriculture emissions with that guidance rather than the overall sector guidance. So it's important to know that the sector guidance plays across those different sectors. From here, we just wanted to quickly introduce one of the carbon neutrality standards, which is the BSI's PAS 2060, which is the carbon neutrality standards for organizations, products, and services. And from this, we wanted to highlight PAS 2060 because it follows a similar philosophy to the VCMI's, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative's claims guidance proposal for companies, which we are going to touch upon shortly. So we can see that there's a consistency between these proposed guidance from the VCMI and the existing guidance on carbon neutrality and the use of credits, that the use of credits is to supplement and support internal emissions reductions, as in order to reach this carbon neutrality standard, companies have to have a deadline for emission reductions, specify their reduction targets, and outline their plans to meet their targets, not just purchase carbon credits to compensate for their carbon footprints. And finally, it's also important to note that companies preparing to use a carbon neutrality standard like PAS 2060 must also be prepared to make all of the supporting documentation to back up that claim public. So in this way, the appropriate use of carbon neutral standards can support and boost the transparency of corporate use of climate credits. So as I noted, the VCMI has released its proposal for guidance for companies on what claims they can make about their use of credits. And there are still areas to iron out, but we at Trove see this as an important development to clarify what kind of net zero aligned present day claims companies can make that support building inequality and integrity in the carbon markets. There are 3 levels of claims that can be made, which is bronze, silver, and gold. But there are some prerequisites to all 3, which we've got up on the screen right now. And as I said, this aligns with the mitigation hierarchy and the approach of existing carbon neutrality claims, that the use of carbon credits should be in addition to, not a substitute for, reducing emissions, and that these claims have to be aligned with setting a long-term commitment to net zero that covers scope 1, 2, and 3. And companies have to make public their plan to achieve these targets and their emissions accountings. So if we just move on, at this point, it's also useful to quickly recap. I saw a question coming in around this in the chat, to recap what the SBTi is currently saying on the use of carbon credits. And this is not to say that the SBTi won't release further guidance in the future on the recommendations for what they call beyond value chain mitigation. But currently they are encouraging the use of high quality reduction credits, high quality removal credits, or early investment in removal technologies for companies to go beyond what they're doing in order to meet their interim and long-term emissions reductions targets. But we think this is what the VCMI is adding, and where the VCMI fills a gap at the moment, is that the VCMI, we think, can make it clear what companies can say and do today with carbon credits in a way that it is high integrity, high trust, and promotes the development of quality carbon credit projects within the market. And this is where we see the VCMI guidance is stepping in. So we want to just quickly step through our presentation of the 3 levels of VCMI's proposed guidance. So firstly, with VCMI Gold, companies have to be on track to hit their interim emissions reduction targets for scope 1, 2, and 3. And then in addition to that, they need to cover all of their remaining emissions, that's 100% of their remaining emissions, with high quality credits, and then set another 5-year interim targets and keep covering all of their remaining emissions each year on track with reaching those interim targets. VCMI Silver has the same reduction requirements as VCMI Gold, be on track to achieve your interim target for scopes 1, 2, and 3. But companies need to make carbon credit purchases to cover at least 20% rather than 100% of the residual emissions. But importantly, that proportion needs to increase in future years, but it can also start higher than 20%. And also it's important to note that companies should consider, when they're looking at how they're going to meet VCMI Silver or Gold, that an increasing proportion of their credits as they get towards their net zero target year should be coming from removals in order to meet that neutralization requirement for their target year, which is why we've highlighted removals here on this chart. And finally, on VCMI Bronze, this functions slightly differently, and what we see it as being is a stepping stone towards silver and gold for those companies that currently have a high barrier to understanding, measuring, and reducing their scope 3 emissions in the short term, or whose scope 3 emissions are very high. It therefore provides a pathway to those higher ambition claims of silver and gold, and can demonstrate a company's intent to get there. So for bronze, companies have to be on target to reach their interim reduction target for scope 1 and 2 emissions, and be reducing at least 50% of their scope 3 reduction targets, but they can then use carbon credits to cover the remaining 50% of that scope 3 mitigation target. But this share of 50% has to fall over time, and bronze is only valid until 2030, by which time the company has to be on track to meet its scope 3 emission reduction targets, and therefore graduate to silver. And they have the same carbon credit purchases to cover at least 20% as existing VCMI's silver claim guidance. So I know we've had a couple of questions coming in on who the VCMI is. So to quickly clarify that, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative is a governance body that seeks to help develop integrity in the voluntary carbon market from the purchasing side through the use of credits and what those credits go towards, and also to promote the use of high quality credits. But one of the principal aims of the VCMI is around this question of what can companies do with credits, and what can companies claim about their use of credits. And it's composed of organizations from across the voluntary carbon market, including those who buy credits, and interested stakeholders as well. I don't know, Guy, if you wanted to jump in and add anything quickly on the composition of the VCMI.
No, it's a multilateral stakeholder group. It's been around for over a year and a half. We were involved in it in the early days, and I sit on the advisory group. And it's yes, it's designed. Its intention is to promote integrity from a corporate point of view, to ensure that the use of carbon credits and the claims that companies make doesn't lead to criticisms of greenwashing, and that there's a robust sort of mitigation action that sits behind the purchasing of carbon credits and the associated claims.
Yeah, so we see it fills a space in that governance landscape for the voluntary carbon markets, alongside organizations like the SBTi and alongside the Integrity Council of the voluntary carbon markets as well. So we see this as an important step forward, and we're interested to see what feedback comes through for the VCMI in their consultation on this proposal. But some of the areas that we think need to be ironed out before the final version is published is, how do you define what is on track to reach an interim target before that target year? How do companies set those 5-year interims when this goes beyond the SBTi's requirements of setting where companies need to send a 5 to 10 year reduction target, not strictly a 5-year target? And how will a high quality carbon credit be defined? The VCMI has not gone too much into this at this point, but they did mention some other key initiatives on carbon credit quality when they launched this proposal that will factor into the final version of the claims guidance. And so on that, I'll hand back to Guy, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of those initiatives and the importance of defining credit quality.
Thanks, Lucian. I've just sort of been replying to Pascal on the chat, and there are other guidance, sorts of guidance out there. The WRI has released guidance on carbon credit use as well. So these aren't the only shows in town, but certainly the most topical, and VCMI has a significant role to play. So just on carbon credit quality, and Chris, I'll hand the microphone over to you, Chris Lees from Standard Chartered, who's on the board of the Integrity Council of the Voluntary Carbon Market, which is we've highlighted here on the left. So I don't want to steal your thunder too much, Chris, but really just to note that there are a number of global initiatives out there really trying to push this integrity issue on the supply side. So the Integrity Council, which was the task force for scaling voluntary carbon markets, and the CCQI, the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative, which is backed by the World Wildlife Fund, Environmental Defence, and the Occo Institute as 3 prominent NGOs in this sector. And really, there's a number of factors that define quality. These were discussed in very generalized terms over the years, but one of the there now sounds to be, I think we're starting to see some coalescence around how you define the quality of a carbon credit. More difficult to measure in practice, but aspects such as additionality, permanence, making sure the reductions are real, effective monitoring, etc., are seeing, and Trove Research will be launching shortly our own quality rating system, which will be built on these methodologies. But the CCQI also expands the boundary to some degree on the definition of quality by looking at how the project can facilitate the transition to net zero in the broadest sense, perhaps through technology pathways, and also the host country ambition as well. So to what extent does a project support the mitigation activities and target setting within the country that it is based, rather than just simply looking at the boundary of the project in isolation. So there's a lot of work going on quality and high integrity, because it does feature across all of these sorts of guidance. And I said to my team, I would say something on corresponding adjustments, because this is for those who don't know, a corresponding adjustment is this thorny problem of a mechanism to adjust the host country's emissions where a credit is exported or used for a purpose, a claim or a compliance claim elsewhere, to make sure you don't double count. So I sort of took a quote from Hamlet and Yorick: to adjust or not to adjust, that is the question. it is a point of discussion that's been around for several years and still hasn't had unanimity in the guidance area. For those who are pro corresponding adjustments in the voluntary market, the main reason for doing so is it avoids the potential risk of double claiming for both the host country where the project is based and also on the purchaser's balance sheet or emissions ledger. Those perhaps against the use of corresponding adjustments in the voluntary market would say that the company's emissions don't actually overlap with national emissions inventories, so there is no double counting, and the claiming issue is something that is less important. And also that they could, by requiring these adjustments for the voluntary use, it could limit private finance to countries in need of that finance to support their mitigation efforts. We're not now going to talk much more about that, but just to say it's an issue out there in how companies see and potentially may use carbon credits. And we have produced a number of reports on this subject ourselves. If you go to our website, you can read them and download them. And we will also be producing fairly shortly a new report on the impacts of the voluntary carbon market on tropical forest countries, where we will look at the implications for corresponding adjustments. So that's coming out soon. And then finally, just in the interest of time, disclosure. Having gone through all of the internal target setting and potential purchase of carbon credits, how do you communicate that externally? Well, the landscape is changing, the goalposts are moving, and they're moving towards an environment of much more complete disclosure. There's a number of initiatives in the financial sector now looking at, from an investor's point of view, Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, the UK has introduced legislation, France, and even the SEC is challenging some ESG funds in the US. The Bank of New York Mellon was fined recently for misstatement of ESG funds. So that really sets the tone for how companies need to be very clear and complete and accurate in how they disclose their targets and also their use of carbon credits against those claims. And finally, we did a review at the beginning of the year of just under 1,000 companies' disclosures of their climate activity, their emissions in particular, and their target setting. And we found a number of shortcomings. So if there are any companies on the line, this is perhaps a useful checklist of things to make sure you get right. When looking at scope 1 and 2, there are different ways of presenting those numbers. It's very helpful if you use both approaches. There's a location-based and a market-based approach, particularly for electricity-based emissions. Making sure that the base year data is easily identifiable. It'd be surprising how many companies don't do these. Intensity-based metrics, again, all the assumptions and metrics behind them need to be disclosed. Data tables, infographics that show changes over time, so you can see how a company is progressing against its target. And also it's very useful to have companies agreeing within the sector on ways to account for emissions. And that also translates into scope 3, where we think that there's a lot of scope for improvement in terms of how industries can get together and agree common approaches to some of the more tricky areas of scope 3 emissions estimate. Just a sort of a side point on targets, it would be very helpful if we retain the use science-based to only refer to SBTI related claims, because some companies are using those terms somewhat loosely. And just on scope 3, it's the most difficult area of reporting and target setting, which many companies will know. But because of those uncertainties, it's really important that companies explain very clearly the assumptions and calculations behind their boundaries. The Global Reporting Initiative, the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Protocol, sets out some really helpful guidance, and it's very useful if companies follow that closely. So that's our chalk and talk piece. Sorry, it's run over a little bit. I just want to hand over now to Chris and Hannah. Hannah, can I go to you first and ask you to say a few words about how Unilever is approaching the climate target setting and carbon credit world?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Guy, and really nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I will briefly talk a bit about Unilever's kind of perspective on the whole net zero target setting debate, and then where carbon credits fit in our corporate strategy, and how we're engaging initiatives such as VCMI. I mean, I think, we're broadly talking about whether this kind of, increases the likelihood of us managing to stay within the 1.5 temperature goal of the Paris Agreement or not. I think, whenever we talk about how carbon credits fit into our net zero strategy, that's the thing that we have in mind the whole time, and how to balance this, this accusation that this is just going to legitimize business as usual versus the, acknowledging this huge need that we know is there to scale finance, into clean tech, into nature restoration, into natural climate solutions. So just to sort of set out Unilever's targets. So we have two SBTi approved emissions reduction targets. One is a 2030 target, which is 100% reduction of our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2030 on a 2015 baseline. So that is obviously, a kind of very black and white, clear target, and we are, making good progress against that target. We also have also a 2030 target that covers our whole value chain, and this was initially set back in 2010 at the beginning of the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. That was our kind of original corporate sustainability strategy, and that covers our entire value chain, so our upstream scope 3 emissions and our downstream scope 3 emissions, including our consumer use, including the energy that you use when you take a shower with one of our products or boil your kettle or whatever. And that's an intensity target. So that's to halve the GHG footprint of our products on a per consumer use basis by 2030. But those are both SBTi validated. And then on top of that, and 2 years ago in 2020, we decided to set a net zero target. We are part of the Climate Pledge, so we're in the sort of 2040 or earlier club. We decided to set it rather strangely for 2039. That was because we thought 2039 sounded a lot sooner than 2040. It's kind of in the next decade. It's not 2 decades out. So that's for that. We have a net zero by 2039 target as well. In terms of the scopes of that target, what we decided was that we would exclude consumer use emissions from that target. So whilst our 2030 sort of full value chain halving intensity target includes consumer use, we decided to exclude consumer use for the purposes of our net zero target. Frankly, we decided that when it comes to netting our residual emissions in 2039, we don't think that those emissions belong to us. They're someone else's scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that was the rationale for that. In terms of our approach to offsetting, within that sort of framework of targets, what we have said is that, we will, when we get to 2039, we will use only carbon removals to, net out any residual emissions in 2039. But before that date, we won't use carbon offsets to meet our interim carbon reduction targets. Obviously, we can't; they're SBTi approved. And so what we have said, however, is that, despite the fact that we've said we will, overwhelmingly focus on, decarbonisation, driving deep reductions in our value chain carbon emissions, over this decade, well into the next decade. What we have said, though, is because we have these, we have deep roots in agricultural and tropical forest commodity supply chains, we recognise this, really important, critical need to scale finance, into these areas, is that we want to find a way of enabling and supporting our brands to make investments into these areas, and where the brands might see a business case in doing so, to kind of turn those investments into carbon neutral claims at brand level. So I think this is very much kind of, echoes what was said earlier in terms of the diagrams and the various VCMI guidance, is that we will do carbon removals to get to at our net zero point, and before then we will make additional beyond value chain investments in nature, and possibly tech solutions as well. We haven't ruled those out, but kind of as a company, as a kind of a company with agricultural supply chains, nature-based solutions and natural climate solutions are the kind of natural starting point for us. I mean, it's very, very early days. I was sort of invited on to share my experience in doing this, and I sort of said, well, we don't have a huge amount of experience at this point. We're just starting out, and we've got a couple of Unilever brands that are kind of dipping their toe into the water here, that have made some small purchases of carbon offsets in recent years, but this hasn't happened at all on a large scale yet. And I think the reasons are there's been I guess a lack of understanding and a lack of kind of comfortableness, I guess, with the voluntary carbon market. We're acutely aware of all the controversies around it, and the risk of being seen to be just carrying on as usual and buying credits on the side to legitimize that. I think there's been a lack of we haven't seen huge consumer demand for carbon neutrality at a product level, and I think there are many of us who that makes total sense. We know what the big shifts in consumer behavior are. We know what needs to happen. We need to make sure that we shift. Consumers start to eat much more plant-based diets, and we need consumers to shift to low carbon energy supplies. What we don't want to obsess over is whether they helping them to choose between one type of shampoo and another, because one's got X grams of carbon and the other carbon neutral, etc. So I think we've been sort of toying with the sort of usefulness of carbon neutral claims at a consumer level as well. And then also there have been claims, concerns, I guess, around quality and integrity that I think some of the initiatives that you've been talking about, like VCMI and ICVCM, are starting to answer and starting to piece together. So I think we feel like the landscape is sort of coalescing around these kind of guidelines that will make it a lot easier for us to kind of engage with this space in future.
Can I, Hannah, could I just pause for a second there?
Yes, sure.
Thank you so much. It's really, really useful to have that real corporate level experience. Often we're at risk in the industry of sitting in our ivory towers, and it's just really, 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 really helpful. But I think it's a really great link then to Chris, who can respond to that sort of existential question around quality and assurance. And Chris has been intimately involved in the ICT. Yeah, Chris, please give us an update from your side.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks very much. I mean, just before I go into that, I also want to just comment on the VCMI's their own CCPs as it happens. Just to say that, look, whatever can be done to encourage and clarify the rules around the use of carbon credits is great. At the end of the day, the whole point, and we'll talk about this in a minute, the whole point of carbon credits is to get money into projects that wouldn't get that good otherwise, to reduce emissions that wouldn't happen otherwise. So there is this abiding concern around companies using carbon credits to basically get themselves buying indulgences, get out of jail free. But the evidence is that that's not the case, right? When you look at most companies that actually do buy carbon credits, they've also got targets, they've also got a lot of other obligations. But notwithstanding that, the whole point about carbon credits is they should be above and beyond what people are already doing. I get that. But in many cases, being able to reduce those emissions, in this time scale that we would like, is not really possible using current technology. Certainly within your own value chain, as I'm sure a company like Unilever can attest to, how difficult it is to actually decarbonize. So we should still encourage as much money as possible to go into projects around the world that will do that. And so if the VCMI guidance can do that, then that's great. I would like to see more clarity on what they actually mean, gold, silver and bronze, what that actually equates to in terms of a claim. We've seen a few questions around that. How does that actually work out? At the end of the day, companies that make claims want to get some kind of recognition or reward for it. If they don't, they won't bother. All right, and then they'll just stop using these markets, and I don't think that'll be in the interests of anyone. But so moving on from that, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets, and again that word integrity crops up, is, if you like, the yin to VCMI's yang. We are the focusing on the quality of carbon credits, and the Integrity Council came out of the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Markets, which I hope many people on this call are already aware of. And the idea being that we would come up with after much deliberation last year and consultation, we came up with 3 areas that we were going to focus on. The first is setting up these set of core carbon principles. The core carbon principles are a high threshold quality level that all carbon credits should adhere to. And if a company, or sorry, if a standard setter wants to meet that threshold, then they'll become eligible, and they'll actually get accredited as being able to meet the core carbon principles that we're working on. We also set up a governance body, and I'm a member of that. I'm on the board of the Integrity Council, and so we have a very, very high, again, high integrity, high quality group of individuals on the board. There are 22 of us, including at least 3 members of the so-called Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities, IPLCs, but also across academia and civil society. In fact, there are only 3 representatives from the market, of which I am one, and I'm voted for, but was voted in by the participants in the TSVCM. So it was a great honour to be there, but I'm one of very few. And then we have an expert group that's been working on the core carbon principles. And again, that expert group, I can truly say that is, extremely talented, and extremely knowledgeable about the carbon markets and the various different ways that carbon credits can be produced, whether it comes from renewable energy, nature-based solutions, or indeed new technologies that are being developed. So there really is a high level of expertise, and the important thing that we've said all along is that integrity is absolutely crucial to this market. With the integrity, then there is the chance for the scale to arrive, the scale that we need, the billions of dollars that we need to actually reduce reduce emissions around the world, and many billions of tons of carbon emissions reductions, avoidance, and indeed removals that are needed. So as I said, we basically had 3 mandates that we're looking at. The first is to establish these core carbon principles, but also an assessment framework. So the assessment framework is almost as important, if not more important, than the core carbon principles, because that's actually going to be looking at the existing carbon credits and projects around the world, and seeing how they do actually meet the principles, and also how they could meet the principles in future as they adapt. We're going to be continually ratcheting up the quality and raising the bar. That's going to be one of the important things, and sending signals to the market about how that quality will improve. We should be providing governance and oversight of how the carbon programs are applying the CCPs, as well as on the market infrastructure and participant eligibility. And then we'll be working with the range of players across the ecosystem to build links and drive continual improvement in the market. So as I mentioned, we've assembled this world-leading expert panel who had a number of subgroup meetings, working daily to pull these core carbon principles together. They have now finished that work, and we are due to be publishing the core carbon principles and the assessment framework in July. Now the CCPs, as I say, they're in 2 parts. Firstly, there's a quality principles for carbon credits, so that's going to include additionality, permanence, and so on. And secondly, integrity principles for carbon crediting programs, including program governance, robust independent validation and verification. So really making sure that the program setters themselves are up to scratch. Now, a lot of this work is going to lean on some of the work that was done by Corsair, but not all of it. It's certainly going to be a revision of that work. And again, we're looking for standard setters to apply to the Integrity Council to actually become to meet those eligibility criteria. So for a carbon credit to be approved as CCP compliant, it needs to meet the quality principles and to be issued by a program that meets the program integrity principles. So we're going to then finally define certain attributes of carbon credits that need to be tagged in registries. So this is where we can think things such as a corresponding adjustment. It could be looking at some of the social benefits. It could be looking at whether the carbon credit is a removal or an avoidance stroke reduction project.
Yeah, just to sort of paraphrase that, the Integrity Council is doing an amazing job, and its list of to-dos has been long and tiresome to work through. But if I could just sort of pause there, Chris, and say,
sure,
Hannah, from a corporate's point of view, having heard Chris give that very robust and sort of powerful defense of what's going on the supply side, are you reassured now, or are you more reassured or getting reassured about the improvements and the integrity and quality of credits for use in a corporate environment, notwithstanding the product related issues that you have to sort of try and sell internally?
Yeah, I think
just before you answer that, very quickly, there is going to be the consultation comes out in July. It will last 60 days. So there's going to be an opportunity for you and others and everybody on this call to participate. So we really would encourage that. Yeah. Sorry, great. Please go ahead.
And apologies for the lawnmower that's going on outside my house. I hope no one can hear it too loudly. But no, it does definitely reassure. I think what's particularly reassuring was the slide that you put up earlier, which showed the sort of synergies between the ICBCM and the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative. You know, the sort of seeing the kind of, you know, the fact that everyone's, you know, arriving list of things to sort out. COP26 in Glasgow, plus sort of meaningfully and get that mean in practice.